Welcome to Commander Central episode 215, and today we're going to talk about board wipes and why we're running the ones we're running. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.
All three of us back together again. How's it going, guys?
Doing good.
Wonderful.
I actually ran into Chris yesterday. I had to run into my LGS to pick up a few cards, and Chris was there doing something with the family. What were you there for, Chris?
I was selling some stuff. I might have spent $14,000 yesterday.
What did you spend $14,000 on?
I might have bought a camper.
A camper? Okay, it wasn't like cards or something.
No.
All right, a camper, that is an activity you can do that doesn't have to, you don't have to be in a crowd. You can get some people together and go camping at a campground. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the way that everything's going is just like, hey guys, we're all bored at home. Why don't we just go to a campground for like 3 days and just enjoy the, outdoors and stuff.
Fresh air, throw up a campfire, that makes sense. I can see that.
Yeah.
Very cool.
How about you, Max? How you doing?
Pretty good. Just taking it day by day. Happy it's the weekend. I'd have not bought a camper, unlike Chris.
Yeah, things are relatively quiet here too. I had a few games I got in this week on the EDHRec cast stream, so that's always kind of nice to play. We got to play with one of our Patreon supporters here, Josh Swope, got on and played, so that was fun to play some games with him. I think you played with him in Kansas City last year, right, Max? When you were there as well.
I did. He has the Varchild deck with the little baby dolls for the tokens, right?
He does, yeah. So and it was funny because he had those. He played the deck on stream and had the babies out, and we got to hear Joey multiple times say the phrase, "Okay, so I guess I'm sacrificing this baby." There's always a fun phrase to have to say in front of 150 people on a stream. So
right,
that was a good time. I got to win a game with my Athreos deck, actually because it was a Varchild game, because everyone had a ton of the tokens out, and I was able to drop a Revel in Riches and then a Pestilence effect and just wiped all the creatures. And Joey was playing Sir Conrad, so the Sir Conrad triggers actually killed Josh and Matt, but because I have so many effects in the deck that keep me from taking damage from my own Pestilence, it also kept me from taking the Sir Conrad damage.
Because it's from a color source, not
from
the source itself.
From a black source. Yeah. So then I made 28 treasure tokens, and Josh and Matt got knocked out. I had to pass to Joey, who just lost his entire board state. He's like, well, I need to top deck a way to kill you. And he couldn't do it, obviously, so it passed to me, and Revel in Riches got the win. So that's always a fun way to win a game.
That's awesome.
I think you got to play at least one game on stream this week, didn't you, Max? Or online, at least? Yeah,
I played some virtual EDH this week with Ryan Sullivan and one of his students, and Dracolution from our Slack. We got a game in. I was playing Dramoka, and just a Valduk deck wrecked us with Impact Tremors and Torbrand out all at the same time, dropped a handful of tokens, and murdered the entire table.
That would do it. Valduk makes a lot of bodies, and if you have Perforos or Impact Tremors out, it's GG pretty quick.
Let me re-say that. It killed 2 of the 3 of us. The Golos player playing Golos Dragons ended up winning. He just had a board state that Valduk couldn't get through, but Valduk took out 2 of us.
Yeah, that's that's a really effective commander. That was an uncommon too, wasn't it, in Dominaria, I believe?
I think
Golos?
So.
Or not Golos, Valduk.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, that there's a couple, because I think Sir Conrad was as well. We've had a couple of really strong uncommon commanders the last few years.
Yeah, Sir Conrad coming out of Throne of Eldraine. Oof.
Yeah, rough. Well, if you out there in social media land or the listener world would like to reach out to us and say hi, how would you get a hold of us, Chris?
You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can search us up on Facebook, CMDR Central. And you can find us online at cmdrcentral.com.
You can also find us over at patreon.com/cmdrcentral. You can check out our reward tiers. If you are so inclined to support us financially, you get access to our Slack where you can talk with all the other patrons and play EDH with them. I am so impressed with our community, always firing games off at any point in the day, it seems like, at this point. So that's a great community to be a part of. And I also want to throw out that they're doing a Gumball deck challenge. The rules are pretty simple. You pick a really powerful commander, and then the rest of your deck can't have any rares or mythics, and all the cards have to be 25 cents or less, including your land base.
And this is going to somehow, I think, turn into some kind of a grudge match with CCO at some point, I believe you said, right?
Yes, I believe Lenny Woolley, who was on the show a few weeks back, has sent the challenge over to that community as well.
Nice. Always fun to interact with those guys, so that'll be cool. You mentioned that last night to me, Max. I'm like, what is a gumball deck? I had not ever heard of that concept before.
Neither had I. It's super cool. I'm actually intrigued.
Fun. Well, we have a couple of other big announcements here. We'll let Max handle the first one.
Yeah, so first we're going to start talking about a giveaway. We haven't been doing some lately, mainly because we've been getting this one ready. Listener and Patreon supporter Andrew Nolan reached out to us a few months back, and he sent us a bunch of cards just as a thank you for helping him, de-stress during the week and by listening to us. And by cards, we mean packages of foil promos that an LGS typically gets. So we're talking full art foil augur boluses, Time Wipes, Paradise Druids. There's also the Buy a Box promo Kenrith the Returned King, Haunt of the High Tower, Rien, Angel of Rebirth, the time-stamped foil Astral Drift, and the non-foil Flusterstorm Buy a Box from Modern Horizons. So what we've decided to do is we're gonna make 12 bundles of all those cards, and at the end of August, beginning of September, we're gonna give away 10 of those bundles to 10 lucky Patreon supporters. So if you support us by the end of the month or continue to support us, you'll be entered in to win those. And then the other 2 bundles we'll be giving away on Twitter to 2 random people who retweet and follow us.
So we'll put out an individual tweet for that contest as well that people can retweet, and that will enter you in a chance to win one of those bundles of cards as well. So thanks again, Andrew Nolan. That was a crazy generous thing to offer us. He will, like Max said, he mentioned that he was going to send us some stuff. So I'm like, oh, cool, thanks a lot. And I got this box of promo cards that I was shocked to open and see. So that was just insane for him to have offered that to us. So thank you very much, Andrew Nolan. We really, really appreciate it. And we're going to send those out to a bunch of different patrons and people on Twitter. So thanks a lot. And Chris, why don't you take this second announcement we have here?
Oh, I have been waiting for this for so long. I haven't told anybody at all. So this is going to be awesome. So we had a local artist by the name of Grace Morris put together some art for each of us. You can find her work online at inkblotmorris.com and on Instagram at inkblot, that little underscore line thingy. Don't ask me because I'm not a tech guy. Morris.
Underscore, that is exactly what it is.
You're exactly correct, yep.
Okay, I didn't know what it was. This little underline thingy, whatever. We then had artist Robert Bareth. Thank you, Dana, for putting notes up here as to how properly pronounce that. Create Planeswalker frames for the cards with abilities we designed, both the traditional Walker frame and the box topper style frame. You can find Robert on Twitter at RealBareth, and you can see his work at amarantalchemy.com. I think I pronounced that properly.
I think that's correct.
We're going to send out one of each of these, plus maybe a little something extra, to our $30 patrons. $10 patrons get one of each of the non-toppers, and everyone else gets a random non-topper card. Now, Magic Fest are obviously off this year, but if we play a game online, or assuming events do kick back up within the next year, and assuming the pot is okay with it, you can run these against us in a game as a special 101 first card per rule 0, just random, hey, let's have fun type of deal, and see if you can whoop us with our own Planeswalker.
I'm really excited to actually see someone play one of our own cards against us in a game. That would be fantastic to actually lose to ourselves.
I'm not, because I like killing people with how my card's designed. I don't want to be killed the same way.
The art turned out really, really great. They look super good in the frames, and I think we found some abilities on the cards that really kind of reflect how we tend to play Commander as well. So
yep.
We'll post that. I'm sure we'll put it in the Slack next. This show will go live on Monday. We'll put the cards in the Slack probably this weekend at some point, and we'll post that stuff on Twitter as well if anyone's curious. Maybe we can even get Raphael to put them on the YouTube channel and the art when it goes live, when he edits this. I'll see if I can get him copies so you can see it there as well. So we'll get that art out there. It just turned out so good, and the cards turned out really cool. They're actually supposed to be showing up at my house in the next hour. I was checking the tracking, and it's out for delivery. It's supposed to be here very soon. So
I can't wait.
Yeah, really, really excited. And I will drop the copies off for you guys just to have for your own personal self, too, at some point in the next couple of days.
Awesome.
Good.
Very cool. So we have 2 big things going on. If you're a Patreon supporter, you're going to get in on those. You'll get a card, or you'll get a chance to win some of those foil promos. If you want to be a Patreon supporter for the end of the month, now is your chance to jump in to get those cards and get a chance to win some of the promos as well. For people that are already our supporters, thank you very, very much. It's a big deal. It helps keep the bills paid and the lights on, and we really, really appreciate it. And we appreciate any support you give us, whether it's just a listen, it's an upvote, it's a like. All of those things that indicate engagement online make a big difference. So thank you all very much for everything you can do to support the show. It means a lot. Let's jump into the main topic here, guys. You ready for it?
Let's do it.
So we did this a few weeks back, show 212, where we talked about counterspells and how they tend to be very specific to what you want from your deck, or maybe even how you play the game personally. Targeted removal, draw spells, mana rocks, maybe. Those tend to be good no matter what you're doing. You know, signets are almost always good, talismans are good, soul ring is always good. It's a little bit different with counterspells, and in thinking about that, it also tends to be true, I think, of board wipes. Those are much more personalized most of the time, depending on what your deck wants to do and how you play. So we thought we would take a look at the board wipes we run and talk about why we run those board wipes or why we don't run other ones, just to kind of give you a window into how our thinking works and hopefully have you think a little bit about why you run the ones you happen to run in your decks. So first things first, we'll just read the list here of the most popular board wipes in Commander.
So the top 5 most popular board wipes for Commander on the EDHRec website is Blasphemous Act at number 1 with 44,000 copies. I'm assuming this is copies, it's not decks that run them?
That's 44,000 decks, yeah. So
okay,
there's
44,000
decks
that
have
wow.
Blasphemous Act.
Okay.
Yeah.
Followed by Wrath of God with 28,000. Merciless Eviction at 27,000, pushed in the 28,000 mark. Toxic Deluge at 27,000 and Damnation at 23,000.
Then the back half of the top 10, we have Supreme Verdict coming in at just over 23,000, Austere Command at 23,000, Fumigate at 18,000 decks, Living Death at 18,000 decks, and Decree of Pain at 16,000 decks.
That's a pretty big gap between Wrath of God and Blasphemous Act, too. It's not twice as much, but it's not far off from being twice as much. Is there anything about this list, just the most popular ones, that kind of caught your eye or surprised you guys?
Not surprising by any means, because I know how board wipes are created, but majority of these are all in the colors of white and black. I mean, that immediately you see that right away. You don't see anything like anything in blue or anything like that, because they just kind of don't exist type of deal.
Sure. Yeah. Supreme Verdict is the only one in the list that is multicolor, which I guess isn't surprising. Like, statistically, multicolor decks, there's just less decks that can run something that's both blue and white versus something that's, just white or just red or something. There's a lot more combinations that support a single color Wrath versus a multicolor Wrath. So I guess that really isn't surprising. But it also probably kind of shows how popular Supreme Verdict is. If it's able to crack the top 6, despite going in a lot less decks, that's pretty impressive about how popular that card is for most people.
I want to say it's probably the most powerful out of the Wraths out there, just due to the simple fact it can't be countered. So pretty much it's coming down, and if you don't have protection, it's going to go off.
4 mana is really efficient too.
Yeah.
Blasphemous Act, I mentioned how much higher it is than anything else. That was a card that not many years ago, I mean, at this point, I guess it's like 5 or 6 years ago, but I remember when I was first looking at, when I was playing Commander the first year or so, and I realized I was not running enough board wipes. I'm like, well, what do I have in my collection, or what's cheap? And at the time, you could get Blasphemous Act for under $1.
I wish.
And I think people just didn't number one, Commander was probably a little less popular. And we're talking Return to Ravnica era, roughly. So 6,
when it was
7
just
years ago.
to start blooming.
Just starting to blow up. But I also think people didn't maybe really realize that 9 mana casting cost on it wasn't ever 9 mana. Because Rift was a cheap card too at the time. Rift you could get for $1 or $2.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So I think people didn't really think about the impact of how multiplayer affected how those cards got cast. But Blasphemous Act, people have clearly figured that out, because it's by far the most popular one of these. And that makes sense, since it almost always costs a single mana. So that one isn't really surprising. It's everyone has caught on, and that I thought was really interesting.
Well, a worst case scenario, I mean, even if you cast it for 4 like the rest of the Wraths, it's a 13 damage in red. So I mean, it's pretty much a Wrath in red.
Yeah, and there's additional utility too, Chris. We talked last week about dealing damage out of the combat step. If you're playing like a repercussion deck or something where damage dealt to creatures, you just kill your opponents. I mean, you might kill yourself too, depending on what you have for creatures, but like that's some added utility there as well.
Well, as I've learned playing with you for the years, as long as you have at least one life left, you're good.
I still learn that lesson like once a month, Chris. It's okay.
I'll say that I believe that just happened to Max a couple weeks back when we actually got to play in person. The other thing I noticed when I was looking at these, all but 3 of them have shown up in precons. Damnation hasn't been, Supreme Verdict hasn't been, and Fumigate hasn't been, but the rest all pop up in precons, so that probably helps their popularity a little bit too, since they just are cards people wind up in their collection because they buy a precon.
Yeah, I had to think back on the Supreme Verdict one because I know it had just gotten reprinted. So I went back through and it wasn't a precon. It was one of the master sets that it got reprinted in.
Yep. And Fumigate's been cheap for a long time too. That probably helps out there as well. Although I think it's starting to creep up. It's a couple bucks now, but Fumigate was cheap for a long time. That probably helps it. So that makes a big difference there. The other thing that jumped out at me when I was kind of looking at this is I found I could kind of lump board wipes into 3 categories or at least come up with 3 categories that factor in when you make a decision. The first one to me seemed to be what the board wipes actually hit in terms of things in the field. For example, modular things you can tweak them to hit artifacts and enchantments, or you can hit, creatures, whether we're talking Austere Command or Merciless Eviction. You can adjust what they hit. You also have things like Merciless Eviction, again, that exile stuff. So I think that's a factor. People tend to look for things that destroy more stuff. When you're comparing Wrath of God to Day of Judgment, it's the exact same card, except Wrath of God gets around regeneration.
It sure does.
Yeah.
Now, there's not that much regeneration out there, but there's some. And if you're casting 2 spells with the exact same CMC, why not pick the one that hits more things?
Yes.
So what they hit, I think, tends to be a factor. How efficient they are tends to be a factor in terms of casting cost. Toxic Deluge costs 3. We mentioned Blasphemous Act costs 1. It's not a coincidence. I think Blasphemous Act usually costing 1 makes a huge difference when people pick it. It does for me, for sure. And the third one I could think of was, is there an upside offered with a board wipe? Decree of Pain draws you a ton of cards when it goes off. Fumigate can gain you a ton of life. We mentioned Blasphemous Act in a repercussions kind of deck can do damage to people, but Chandra's Ignition in a whole lot of decks is just a win condition. That's a lot of upside in that card as well. Are there any other conditions that you guys think of when you're looking at a board wipe that pop out to you, or do those 3 kind of cover it?
I think those 3 cover it for me. The only other thing I would think about is how they play into the deck I'm putting it in, like a sacrifice versus an exile type effect.
Sure. And that definitely does come up sometimes. The example I can think of is when I built that Athreos deck, I didn't run Toxic Deluge specifically because my commander is indestructible. And I was like, well, it's nice to have my commander dodge my board wipes. So I didn't want something that would kill indestructible creatures, and Deluge gives stuff -/, so it will kill my commander. But I did put Merciless Eviction in the deck because I felt like, well, yeah, it's an exile, so it does get on indestructible too. But there's so many times I'm going to use that just for artifacts or enchantments or planeswalkers or something that it was worth occasionally using Athreos to it. So that's a definitely factors in, I guess, for me as well, how often it affects your deck, for sure. So Max, since you just mentioned that, why don't we talk about one of your decks first?
Sure. I think we can start with Dramoka, because that's the deck I probably run the most board wipes in.
Okay.
So I run 5, and one of them is more of a one-sided board wipe, and we'll start with that. So Settle the Wreckage. It eliminates one player's attacking creatures. It's a very defensive spell. In that deck, I've also used it in other decks as a ramp spell just to exile my own tokens or something like that. But I seem like people have forgotten about this card, so they don't see it coming, especially in a all-flying green-white deck. And it's 4 mana, and nobody really questions 4 mana being left up versus, 7 for Rift or 4 for Wrath of God, in your first main phase or something like that.
Well, it's also that kind of card in, say, the Dramoka deck is you have a lot of high CMC cards that come out. So it's like, oh, he's got 4 mana left. Well, he just can't cast anything, so they don't think about it.
Right.
It's also one of those things that I've having got hit with it a few times. Yeah, okay, I'll go get 3 lands, but it's usually at a point in the game it's just irrelevant. The lands are nice, but it's absolutely almost never worth losing, particularly if you're going for an alpha strike. I'm like, I'm going to kill Max right now, and then the game's going to be over because there's one person left who has a terrible board state, and I can wipe them out easily. So the wreckage comes down, you lose all your stuff and get 3 lands, and who cares? Because Max, who I thought I was going to be able to kill because he had, his 3 creatures that were tapped, now untaps those 3 creatures and kills me, and then mops up the 4 with the last person who had no board state. So yeah, the land thing seems like it could be a big deal, but at the time you tend to cast that card, it just doesn't make a difference usually.
I mean, it also probably would help if you ran more than 6 basics in your decks, Dana.
Let's not get crazy. Basic lands, come on.
I think that one time I played Glissa, I swear to God, there was only 3 basic lands in that deck. I could not find any to save my life.
I think at the time that happened, I had 10 in there.
Okay.
I have now raised that up to 14.
There
but
we
at
go.
the time I think it was at 5 of each.
Yeah, I was just shocked because it was a 2-color deck. I was like, really?
I was perhaps being a little greedy with my utility lands. I will admit that. So what else do you have in that one, Max?
Another kind of more unique board wipe for this deck is single combat. It essentially lets everybody chooses a creature or a planeswalker, and they sacrifice the rest, and then nobody can cast creature or planeswalker spells till the end of my next turn. I really like this type of board wipe in Dromoka because, like Chris said earlier, I run a lot of big, high-costing creatures that have a good body on them, so if I can keep Dromoka on the field and sacrifice a Wingmate Rock instead, I still have my commander. People can't do stuff on my turn. It just really helps me kind of control the game while keeping, a win con in place.
Yep, I'm assuming this card is what replaced Divine Reckoning, because I know a couple years ago you and I had a long talk about Divine Reckoning, and where it's Divine Reckoning is a sorcery for 4 mana that says each player chooses a creature they control and then destroys the rest with flashback.
Yes.
So you get to save your big beater while, wrecking everyone else's day with the other stuff, because they may have 1, but usually your creature's better if you're casting this card.
Right, and you're right, Chris. This did replace Divine Reckoning just because of it hit Planeswalkers was the big thing for me.
Yep.
Yeah, because we definitely had a window there, particularly after War of the Spark, where we saw a lot of Planeswalkers showing up in decks, more so than we had been previously.
That's
I think that's
an
kind
understatement.
Yeah. I think it's kind of tailed back a little bit, especially people playing on webcam. I think have pulled a few of them out of decks, so it's maybe less of a big... But there's still a lot of Planeswalkers out there, for sure.
Yeah.
What else, Max?
So the other board wipes in this deck are Wrath of God, Cleansing Nova, and Austere Command. And those 2 are, like Dana mentioned earlier, modular, so I can pick and choose what I want to destroy based on where we are in the game.
Yeah, Austere Command is so good, and Cleansing Nova is not quite as good, but it's still pretty good. I very rarely feel bad about drawing Cleansing Nova, and it saved my butt plenty of times being able to, occasionally it's just a more expensive Wrath of God, and that doesn't feel great, but there's enough times when it saves you being able to wipe artifacts and enchantments, for sure. And you still have the old school Wrath of God. Do you just like that because it's efficient?
Yeah, it's efficient. It's 4 mana. Regeneration doesn't come into play that often anymore. Back, a few years ago it did, but I think at one point I was running Wrath and Day of Judgment, and I just eventually swapped Day of Judgment out for Settle the Wreckage or Divine Reckoning, a few years ago. So it's just efficient. 4 mana, blow everything up. I'm good with that.
Gets the job done. And then it usually, oftentimes too, if you're talking like turn, 9 or something, it leaves you with enough mana free because it's efficient to cast something, and maybe you have Hall the Bandit Lord out, so you can give it haste too. Like there's enough times that saving 1 or 2 mana on it is what's going to let you get an extra poke on somebody too.
Mm-hmm.
5 board wipes too. That's interesting. I don't think I have that many. Most of my decks don't have that many, but it looks like you have that many in most of your decks, so we can maybe talk about that here in a little bit. But first, I think we'll jump over to Chris's Mogus deck and talk about his board wipes. What do you have in that deck, Chris?
I have 4 to 5 of them. I love how I put it 4 to 5, because some people might not consider some of these cards board wipes technically. But I run Blasphemous Act, Damnation, Decree of Pain. Then my other 2 in here that are kind of like, well, they could be board wipes, could not be, is Rakdos, Lord of Riots. I do believe that's the right one, or Rakdos, Showstopper. That's the one that I'm thinking of.
Showstopper is the Wrath, yep.
Yep, comes in. And then Ruination, which is destroy all non-basic lands. So I considered Ruination technically a board wipe because you are technically wiping the board of something.
Sure.
It's not, creatures or artifacts, We're kind of coming down to like the Austere Command thing, like, oh, well, you can run it for all artifacts or enchantments or stuff like that. This is strictly just lands, so... And then I like the Rakdos Showstopper just because, hey, it's a big beater creature too. What's up?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm guessing Blasphemous Act is in here just because it's so efficient.
Yes.
That completely makes sense here. Yeah, Rakdos, big beater creature. Decree of Pain. Decree of Pain is a card I like. Do you ever feel like it's a big ask to cast the mana, or is it worth to be able to be greedy sometimes?
It's worth it sometimes, but there have been a lot of times where I have it in hand and I want to cast it, but I'm like short of mana or something.
Sure.
And I'm just like, I wish this was any other board wipe because it would change the game, but I have to wait. And cycling it doesn't do enough for me right now. So
right. It's a card I think I have it in one deck. I wouldn't want to run it in every deck because, like we mentioned, that's a big ask sometimes and it does feel bad. But it's also one of those cards that when it drops at the right point in time and you draw 17 cards, it feels so good.
Oh, it's so wonderful.
So I wouldn't want it in all of my black decks, but I think once in a while it's nice to have that luxurious 8-mana board wipe that fills your hand up. It does feel good sometimes, for sure.
Because I've contemplated on putting Toxic Deluge in that slot, but I hurt myself so much in my Mogus deck to begin with.
Yeah.
I'm like, no.
That's a good point. Well, see, that's what we're talking about. That's a good example. Deluge is a fantastic card, but if your deck is one where like you are oftentimes really low on life, you don't want to draw Deluge when you're at 9 life and there's, a Sun Titan and an Avenger of Zendikar in play. And you're like, well, I can't kill the things I need to kill now. So, for sure, that's a perfect example. Whereas, like, if you're playing Oloro, which I think it was in the Oloro Precon, you're perfectly willing to spend 10 life most of the time. That's not going to hurt you at all.
Yeah, because you're just going to gain it back anyways.
Exactly. So we'll jump over and I'll quick mention a few of my decks. My Glissa the Traitor deck, we're looking at Damnation, Decree of Pain, and Toxic Deluge are the wipes in that deck. Again, it's a weird deck. We talked about Ruination for Chris. There's stuff in that deck, like if I happen to have Thornbite Staff and Viridian Longbow out, I can just hit every creature.
Machine Gun Kelly. Blam, 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 blam,
boom, boom, boom.
I wouldn't count that as a board wipe, though. So in that deck, too, my creatures all have Death Touch. There's things like Nemesis Mask I can put on to a creature with Death Touch to give it lure, basically, and kill someone's creatures. I don't really count that, but like that's in the deck as well. So I have additional options there. Decree of Pain, which we mentioned, it's a slow deck. If it was a faster deck, I don't think I would run Decree of Pain, but it's such a slow deck that I think I can afford to have that board wipe that costs that much mana and have it draw me a bunch of cards. And to kind of counter that, I'm running Damnation and Toxic Deluge, which are both really efficient.
Yep.
So that's the spread there. And there's a couple other options in black. And I would feel fine running something like Finale of Life's Finale or something in place of Damnation if I had to, because Damnation is not a cheap card.
Mm-mm.
It's not as bad as it once was, but it's still $40-ish. And if I didn't have one, I would be fine with kind of the budget version. But I have a Damnation, so I'm playing it in that deck, and the efficiency is really, really nice when you're trying to rebuild after the board wipe, for sure. And the other one I'll quick touch on before we move back to Max here is my Athreos deck, which I mentioned. I have Austere Command, I have Cleansing Nova, and I have Merciless Eviction, all of which are modular effects. And being able to tweak your board wipe based on what the biggest problem is in that deck is really, really useful. It's really, really useful in most decks, but the fact that I have 3 different board wipes that all let me target whatever the biggest problem is, I found to be very, very helpful in the short time I've been playing that deck. And I also mentioned this, but I'll mention it again. I didn't run Deluge here, particularly because I wanted to not blow up my own commander, which has Indestructible. Merciless Eviction does hit it, but it was worth the trade-off because there's going to be enough times where it's just going to hit artifacts or enchantments or planeswalkers, and it was worth occasionally losing my commander to that, because Merciless Eviction is so good.
Yeah, also with the Merciless Eviction, if you do exile, your commander goes back to the command zone.
Exactly, right. I'm not even losing it permanently.
Yeah, they lose everything else, and you're not losing the life that you would off of Deluge. So it's kind of a win-win there.
Yep, for sure. So, Max, let's hop back over to you. I think you've got your Regnant Krav deck next.
Yeah, so this is another deck where I only run 3 true board wipes. Merciless Eviction, just because it's so good. It's modular. It deals with anything I have to deal with. Toxic Deluge, because this is a life gain deck, I don't feel bad putting 10 into it or 20 into it if needed.
Right.
I'll gain it back. And then I also run Cleansing Nova here, I think, because I didn't have another Austere Command. I went with this.
Okay.
And then
So this is an example. In this deck, you're choosing to bypass the efficient removal in Damnation, Wrath of God, Day of Judgment for the modular ones.
Yeah, and you mentioned this with your Gwissa deck, Dana. Both Regnan Krav and Dramoka are slower decks, so I don't feel the need to be as efficient. Just I want to be able to have answers throughout the game.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I also run 2 pseudo board wipes, I guess I would call them, with Dictate Erebos, because this is a token deck. I can just clear the board that way. Torment to Hailfire, if I can just produce a bunch of mana, I might be able to get people to sacrifice stuff.
Yeah, because there's a point in the game where they absolutely have to do that because they can't afford to lose the life. Yeah, those all make sense in that deck completely. I get it. Chris, how about your Alesha deck? What do you have in there?
So I have 2 to 3 in here. Sometimes this varies because this is one of the few decks that I have that I tweak depending on power level in the shop or how the meta shifts type of deal. Because at one point this deck was an 8 to a 9 power level, and I was like, well, this is just too much. So I detuned it hard. So it changes from time to time. But the 3 that for sure are always in the deck is Damnation, Wrath of God, and Elish Norn. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say Elish Norn isn't a board wipe, but hey, let me tell you, it sure is.
It feels like it when someone else plays it for sure.
So, I mean, Elish Norn I consider another one of those modulars because it wipes out, little creatures and it lowers the power of other creatures, but it also makes mine much, much tougher to deal with.
Yeah, definitely. And now this is kind of the opposite of Max's Regnan Krav list, where he's not running the efficient stuff. You are leaning into the efficient board wipes with both Damnation and Wrath of God here.
Yep.
But it's a deck with a lot of low CMC stuff too.
Yeah, like God, I think like the highest is probably like Elish Norn, might be like the most expensive card in the deck for CMC base. But with Alesha 2 is the lower CMC, I can blow everything up and then reanimate 2 in the same turn, something of mine, and still get value out of it.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense here. And you don't have a lot of life gain in the deck, so like Toxic Deluge probably doesn't necessarily make a whole ton of sense. Plus, so many of your creatures are low CMC that, like in some decks where you have a bunch of giant bodies, a Toxic Deluge makes sense because you can set it to like 3 or 4 or something and not kill any of your own stuff.
Yep.
When all your creatures tend to be at that power and toughness, it ceases to be a modular effect and just winds up being an expensive board wipe where you're like, I got to spend 9 life to kill all this stuff. So that also totally tracks here. Now, you aren't running Blasphemous Act here.
No, I am not running Blasphemous Act in this deck. I have ran it in the past. And yeah, since I run so many small creatures, I get it to trigger faster too. But I want a guaranteed kill type of cards.
Sure. Well, and that's the problem with Blasphemous Act too. As great as it is, if you're playing against that one deck that has that plays +1 counters, or playing against someone's aura deck or something where like their creature very easily becomes a 17/17, that's not going to do you any good.
Yes.
So there's downsides for Blasphemous Act being as efficient as it is. It's usually worth it, but yeah, there's absolutely situations where it doesn't work.
Yep.
Back to my decks here. My Veil of the Nightclad deck is running All Is Dust and Toxic Deluge. And the thinking here, All Is Dust, you sacrifice creatures that have a color. It's a heavy artifact deck. So not even creatures, it's permanents.
Yep.
Non-land permanents that are colored. In a heavy artifact deck, there's 41 artifacts in that deck. That means it almost always hits everybody else and doesn't hit me nearly as hard. All my creatures, except for my commander, are artifact creatures. So my creatures almost always survive it. And, one person doesn't lose their Solemn Simulacrum or something.
And that person's going, dang it, I wanted it to die.
Lose it. Right. No, occasionally you'll get burned and like one person has a Wormcoil Engine and someone has a, someone has a Hangerback Walker out and you're like, oh, I'm not going to kill those. That sucks.
Well, the Hangerback Walker guy's like, I wanted to die too.
Right, the same thing. Right, that's a good point. Yeah. But by and large, it heavily affects me or heavily favors me to cast All Is Dust in that deck. So that's why that one's there. And I'm running Deluge because it's an efficient deck and there's a bit of life gain in there as well. So I can get away with casting Toxic Deluge and still survive the life I have to pay for it. And also part of the reason in that deck is a lot of times I want to kill people with Vela damage on more than one occasion when someone's blown up a sack outlet of mine and I've had a bunch of 1/1 Thopters or something out. I've used Toxic Deluge set to 1 just to get like 6 or 7 leave the battlefield triggers when all my Thopters die. So on more than one occasion, that's functioned as a way to basically get Vela leave the battlefield triggers without having to wipe my full board.
So now, this is the first blue deck that we've talked about so far now.
Yep.
And I notice you don't have Rift on your list. Do you consider Rift a board wipe?
Yeah, you know what? I probably should have Rift down here because I do consider Rift a board wipe in this deck. I usually try to run 3 things I would consider a board wipe. Functionally speaking, I think Rift functions as a board wipe. Do you guys agree with that?
Yes.
I would.
It's not destroying stuff, but
It's very similar to Settle the Wreckage, just hits everybody, and it goes to their hand versus
Right.
exile.
yeah, again, there's some downsides, but it's instant speed. It's none of your stuff. It's all the things. I think it's close enough to be considered a board wipe for our discussion. So, and I
Yes.
do have a Rift in that deck. I think I have Rift in all of my blue decks, in part because I think I've told the story before, but my first pre-release I went to when I came back to Magic was, I think, Gatewatch or Gatecrash. Might have been Dragon's Maze. It was one of those two.
Gross.
Whichever one had Cyclonic Rift as it was available. I'm not sure if it was in. I can't remember which set it was in.
That would have been a Return to Ravnica.
Was it? Okay. Well, the Gatecrash, the pre-release, though, I think you all actually got 2 packs from each of the previous sets as well for the pre-release.
Yeah, that's how pre-release used to work.
Yeah, so whatever one it was, I got a Cyclonic Rift in my pre-release in my very first event. And I looked at the card and I'm like, okay, well, this seems fine. And it didn't register to me how good it was. And then I got to like one match and we got to turn 8 when I happened to have the, mana free to cast Cyclonic Rift. And I'm like, oh, I can wait a minute. I can bounce all of their stuff but their lands at instant speed when the person's attacking me, like in the middle of the pre-release. I'm like, this card is crazy. I'm going to put it in all my blue decks. I'm like, it's got to be a $10 card though, right? And it was, I like checked after the pre-release. It was like $1.
Yep.
So I picked up, I think that day, the shop had 5 Cyclonic Rifts and I bought all 5. Because I had, I think, 2 blue EDH decks at the time, and I'm like, well, I might as well. I'm going to clearly put it in every deck ever. I might as well grab the 5 they had. It wasn't even like me thinking in terms of finance. I just thought, I'm going to put it in every deck because this card's crazy. So yeah, I Cyclonic Rift, I just happen to have enough lying around from that I can put it on my blue decks, and I run it. It's so good. Max, what's your last one here you want to talk about?
Last one I want to talk about is Brago. So we'll kick it off with Rift itself. I run Rift in this deck. I run Supreme Verdict and I run Austere Command. So kind of not very efficient, except for maybe Supreme Verdict and Rift, but this is more of a aggressive control deck to where I can loop these with like Archaeomancer, and these are more like worst case scenario cards for me, to be honest.
Now, have you considered running Time Wipe in this deck?
The double is really hard for me to get in this deck.
Is it? Okay, because the ability to bounce Brago, blow up everything on the board, and then replay Brago is, in my opinion, huge.
Yeah, that would be really useful.
I've tried it.
I do agree that deck is really heavy on pips sometimes for Max.
Yeah, I mean, Supreme Verdict is about as hard as I want to get when it comes to different differentials and pips. Same thing's true as about like Sphinx's Revelation or Azor. Those are both really heavy pip, and it's hard to cast those sometimes.
You're doing something wrong, Max. We're going to have to look at that deck.
Do you have enough basic lands, Max, after criticizing me?
I think I have 14 in there, Dana.
Okay, well, you do then.
Let me look.
Totally
I have my list in front of
now.
me. I have... Oh, I don't have that many. I have 13 basic lands.
Okay, that's good enough, I think. It's not crazy, but it's good enough. I'd be okay with that anyway. So Supreme Verdict, like if your deck supports the colors, do you feel like you just run it? Like if you're in a 3-color deck with white, blue, or a 4-color deck, do you just run it? Do you think?
No.
No? Okay.
Well, it also depends on how your colors are sitting. Like if, let's say you are running 4 colors, if you're heavier into white and blue, then yes. If white and blue are your like really small splash colors, then no.
Yeah, no, I agree. That was which is kind of the point of all this. Like this stuff becomes really tricky depending on what your deck is, for sure.
Yep.
So yeah, no, I kind of agree there. Because like I have that 5-color Kenrith deck. I'm not running it in that deck because I thought the mana requirements were too tricky to meet. So, yeah.
Well, it's also something to consider, too, when you're doing your deck building, where you decide early on, like if you have an ability to fetch lands, is like, okay, I know in my deck I have a Supreme Verdict that requires double white, so I have to get double white online one way or another.
Right.
Because then I know if I draw this or, anything happens or if I have it, I can cast it.
Yep. That's exactly how I factor this stuff in as well. So, same thinking here. We'll look at a couple more of mine here. I have a Timurit deck and a Kresh deck, both of which have black-red, and I guess Kresh also has green, but there's not much in green aside from, I guess there's a Bane of Progress in that deck, which Chris pointed out when we were doing the notes, so that would count. But they're running very similar package. Both have Blasphemous Act and Chandra's Ignition for the same reasons in both decks. Blasphemous Act is efficient, and both decks are built in a way that creature damage can be a win condition. Timuret is an infect deck, so my creatures almost always have infect or poison or something. So being able to Chandra's Ignition and have it deal damage to a player can be a win condition. And Crash, the creatures all get huge because it's a fling deck. So again, it's a way to turn that board wipe into a way to win a game. The other ones here I will quick talk about that are interesting, at least. My Sigarda deck has Austere Command in it, so I can kind of get around enchantments if I need to and still hit the creatures that are important. And Winds of Wrath doesn't blow up enchanted creatures, so it winds up being fairly one-sided, similar to how All Is Dust works in my Veil of the Nightclad deck. And my Geru deck is running Urza's Ruinous Blast, and in a deck with a bunch of legendary planeswalkers, doesn't hit a lot of my stuff like it hits somebody else. So again, it winds up being a modular board wipe, along with Austere Command and Cleansing Nova in that deck.
So I want to talk about your Sigarda deck for a moment here.
Sure.
And I'm assuming, because Max is probably going to talk about Tuvasa too here in a minute. So these are, I'm just going to lump these two together. These being enchantment-based decks, and they're almost Voltron-y.
Mm-hmm.
Why no like single combat or Divine Reckoning or something to save your guy that's guaranteed to kill something, but will clear the way for you to get through and kill?
What's the logic in your Tuvasa deck, Max?
My logic in my Tuvasa deck is I should have most players killed before I need a board wipe.
Okay.
And you do. Max does have a few counter spells in that deck too.
Right. So in Tuvasa, I run 2 counter spells and Winds of Wrath. Winds of Wrath is 5 mana, and my average CMC is 2.8. So I would rather be suiting up Tuvasa versus saving mana for an extra Wrath. I also run a lot of the Umbras, so like if a Wrath were to happen, good chance Tuvasa is going to avoid that by just getting rid of one of the multiple Umbras on her.
Yep.
Kind of a similar thought a little bit for me in that Sigarda deck. The reason I'm not running the single combat kind of spells there is I've found if I don't have an Enchantress kind of creature out, it's super easy to stall out. The deck really needs to have one in play. So just losing my commander, or just keeping my commander and losing all of those winds up being really difficult to recover from. So that's why if I'm going to wipe the board, I want to be able to dodge either everything or it's just not worth it for the most part. Okay. So Winds of Wrath lets me throw one enchantment at a creature and then hopefully keep my commander and the Verdant Enchantress up or something. And Austere Command lets me kind of tweak around what I want to blow up.
Yep, I was curious about that because I've looked at a lot of other Voltron-y type decks and they don't run those Wraths neither. And personally for me, it didn't make sense because you want to keep your big beater, but you want to force them down so then they know that they're really in a tight spot that you can still, nuke them out if need be.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And actually, it's entirely possible that's something I need to revisit too. That was my thought process 3 or 4 years ago with it. Maybe my deck has changed enough, or talking about losing Enchantress as well, we've since then gotten, the Satyr Enchanter, and we've gotten a handful more. Maybe I can afford to lose them because there's more to draw in the deck too.
Yeah, that could be.
So maybe something is worth reconsidering.
Another thing I think about too, specifically with Tuvasa, it might be a little different for you with Sigarda, Dana, is Tuvasa's 3 mana. So if I'm become like the archenemy in the early game, if someone has to blow their Wrath on turn 4 or 5, I'm kind of okay with that because I can probably recast Tuvasa and an enchantment the next turn just to get the cycle going. So I also see it as a benefit of making my opponents use their Wrath, and maybe they only have 2 in their deck. Maybe they only have 1. So if I'm making them bust that board wipe so early in the game, that just kind of sets me up better for the late game to not have to worry about that one board wipe that might come.
Sure.
So here's something on just what Max said is, like, how many do people actually run in a deck? Because if you do run into that where you only run a 1 or 2 and you use it too soon, then, why not run, like Max runs 5 in Dramoka or whatever. So why not run more so you have more of them to play with?
I don't know what the average is for most players, so I don't know. One thing I will say is I think you can run too many in terms of it just being an annoying deck.
I can think of one.
Well, yeah. So I think we the same example. Our local shop owner has is it a 5-color Planeswalker deck or is it 3 colors now? I don't remember what it was, what it is currently.
5 colors. I think he switched it to Golos. He was running that Jeskai guy who had all 5 colors in his
Joda.
Something in the cart. Yeah, Joda.
Yeah, Joda.
But I know he switched it over to Golos now.
So he had a 5-color Super Friends deck that at one point had like 20 board wipes in it or something.
Oh, it still does.
Does it? Okay. Which like strategically makes sense because they're all ones that don't hit planeswalkers. He has very few creatures in the deck. So like basically board wiping every turn isn't a bad play in that deck, really.
Yep. Yeah, because I think the original build of that deck was the only creature is the commander.
Yeah.
Everything else is planeswalkers. So yeah, the board wipe build like that of running 20 of them is because he needs to protect his planeswalkers. The only way to do that is to board wipe all the creatures off the board.
But it then makes for a super slow game at times.
And it also turns into an archenemy game where the whole table turns on him. They're like, you won't let us have fun? Well, you get to just leave the game then.
So that's a tough thing to balance in that case. And I have thought about that with my Zero deck similarly because it's so many planeswalkers. I would probably, from a power standpoint, be better off running 4 or 5 more board wipes.
Yep.
But I don't want to put that bullseye on myself, and I just don't want to make games take that long. So that's as it is. It's a slow deck. Yep. I don't need to like make things slower.
I think a good number, and this is going off of all of our decks I'm looking at, is 3 to 4 like creature wipes, and then maybe 1 or 2 of something else. Like, we could lump Usher Command as both, but it could be considered as this is just for enchantments and artifacts, so I'm not going to count this as my creature package of removal type of deal.
Yeah, I kind of tend to default to that number as well. It's enough where you have answers, but you don't always have answers. People can kind of play around, or they can get lucky, or they can try to bait out your board wipe versus you just always having it there handy. So yeah, I'm kind of on board with that number myself.
I also think it kind of depends on what you want the deck to do. So like with Brago, I only run 3 and Rift is one of them, but I run 4 or 5 counter spells, which kind of stop the big problems, whether it's like a Crater Hoof or a Tulane or a Corvold, or, I can stop the big problems. And like I said, the Wraths are more of a, in case of emergency, break glass type of thing.
Well, and that's also, your Brago deck is also a deck where you draw a ton of cards, and that increases the chance you're going to see that board wipe. If you don't draw a ton of cards in a deck, maybe you need 6 to consistently see one. If you do draw a ton of cards or filter through cards, you can maybe get away with 3 or 4 and see them just as consistently because you're going through more of your deck.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that definitely makes a big difference as well. What's your last deck here, Chris?
That is my Aminatu deck. My deck that is horribly underpowered. The more and more I look at this deck, I'm just like, this deck needs to be fixed. But I have Supreme Verdict, Wrath of God, and Terminus are my 3 board wipes. Terminus is in there due to the simple fact that Aminatu is kind of more of a miracle commander because you can put cards on top, you can miracle it, all that. And it is basically a planeswalker deck. It only has 3 creatures in it, so Terminus really doesn't affect me at all. And then the other 2 are just value, pretty much. Now, the deck's mainly white and blue anyway, so Supreme Verdict doesn't hurt. And Wrath of God is just really good. And I really didn't want to be that cheeseball and throw another Damnation in a deck. So I'm like, nope, we're not going to put one in here.
Well, and that's a good point, though, too. It's like sometimes it's nice to just keep the package different just so it looks different.
Yes. Just
so it isn't the same as your other deck, just to have a different rhythm and a different feel to it as well. So yeah, and if your deck like we mentioned this too, your deck's playing slower, you can afford to cast some slower ones. If it's not, you maybe don't want to. So that all registers with me for sure. Terminus is a card that is good, or it's not bad, but like if you have a bunch of stuff that manipulates your top deck, it's fantastic.
It is awesome.
So this is a perfect deck for that as well. And again, it's a good example, kind of like you wouldn't run Winds of Wrath outside an Enchantress deck probably. Terminus is way riskier outside a deck that manipulates the top of your library, but in a deck that does, the card's great.
Yeah, because 5 mana, there are much better 5 mana wipes out there. And something that actually destroys stuff, so you don't even have to worry about them, tutoring it back up or something like that.
Although the fact that it gets around indestructible and stuff is pretty useful too. So pluses and minuses for sure.
Yes. And tokens. You just laugh at a token player.
Right. They're just gone. They're just all gone. All right. I think that is going to kind of wrap up why we put what we put into our personal specific decks. You guys have any final thoughts on any of this you want to share?
There's so many thoughts running through my mind with this. Just pretty much like building around a wrath that you have or whatever you want to play in your deck. Make sure that your wraths are set up so they play with the deck. Don't just jam a damnation in a black deck because it's damnation. It's really good because it might actually not play the way that you need it to play. Like Decree of Pain might be the better choice, even though it costs, 4 more mana to make it go off the way that you want it, but it's going to net you way more in the long run.
I remember, and this was fairly recently, someone asked me to look at their deck, and I was looking at it, and they had a damnation in it, and no Wrath of God, and they were also like, I really wish I could put this card in my deck, but I don't have one and I can't afford one. And I'm like, trade your damnation for that card you want and get the person and get whoever you're trading with to throw in a $4 Wrath of God. They're the same card for the most part in your deck. And I think even when I looked at it, the deck had a lot more white mana and white mana sources than it did black anyway. So I'm like, it would just be a better card in general in that deck, but I've seen people do that before too, where they're like, oh, but I have this damnation, and it was like such a chase card for so long. It only had that one printing or two printings, and it's the same card as Wrath of God.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a good point is, let's say that we're talking about like Naya dinosaurs or something. You have all these huge monstrous dinosaurs that cost a high amount of CMC. So what are you really weak against? You're weak against like enchantments or artifacts or something. So play Austere Command over Wrath of God type of deal. So you can get rid of the stuff that bothers you because your creatures should be able to deal with other creatures no problem.
Well, we didn't mention this card. None of us have decks that are running things like Living Death or Living End. When we played on stream this week, Joey Schultz recast Living Death, I think 4 times in a single game.
Oh boy!
With a Marin deck. But that's a perfect card for a Marin deck because like so much stuff is going in your graveyard and you have so many sack outlets, and that's what he was able to do. He was able to sacrifice a bunch of stuff, cast Eternal Witness to bring back Living Death, cast Living Death and then in response to that sacrifices Eternal Witness. So then all his stuff comes back into play including the Eternal Witness, which then brings back his Living Death. So he has it in his hand for next turn.
What kind of cheeseball deck is he playing?
It was Marin of Glandel Thoth, which is just how Marin plays. And actually, that was the game I wound up winning with the Revel in Riches.
Okay. Good. He deserves that, then.
I tend to agree. He absolutely deserved that. But that's a perfect deck for that card, too. Like, I understand why he's running it in there. It's absolutely fantastic in that deck.
Yeah, so if you were playing like mono black, let's say mono black Drana or whatever, you don't play that card because that's not how your deck's meant to be played. You'd be playing the Damnation theme instead.
But I guarantee there's a bunch of people out there with Marin decks that aren't running Living Death just because they haven't really thought through how that synergy will work.
Yep.
So, absolutely. All right, gentlemen, I think that's going to wrap up episode 215 for us. I am Dana. You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find my good friend Max Crandall at CMBR_Max. And you can find my good friend Christopher Degner at WiseSquishy1. Our show was edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find him online at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week with another show. Until then, I am Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.